Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast. So, hello Marcus, I heard you just ran the Paris Marathon. Yeah, Troy, and I heard you're redesigning the future by traveling between Sweden and Portugal and London and doing all sorts of amazing stuff. So apologies, listeners. Today I'm a little bit by myself, which is okay because Troy has the best excuse ever not to be on the show because he's working on some very exciting blockchain project. And so it'll be just me today. And today I will be talking to Jonathan Hemus, who wrote the book Crisis Proof, a very relevant and interesting and insightful book about how do you prepare as a company for a crisis and how much should you and when can you do it. And it was a very interesting conversation, and the book is a really great mix between the somewhat academic side of things and the very practical side of things. So it sits in a very, very great sweet spot. And I think one of the biggest takeaway for the book is that you shouldn't just be crisis proof in a crisis, but actually, if you look at the day-to-day business, you should be able to shift and move and be proactive about doing things differently if new information arrives, even in a team. So quite a few questions I had for him were based around, well, when is a crisis really a crisis? Is a pivot a crisis in a very, very small scale? How do you pivot? How can you enable teams to actually bring that to the leadership? How can leadership enable teams to circumvent a failure or a crisis that can come out of day-to-day work that sort of accelerates exponentially and eventually leads to disaster? And I think in a lot of companies we have this where the way they are structured and the way teams go about it and the way leadership enable the teams eventually leads to some kind of disaster or crisis. So it might just start in a very small scale. And it is probably easier to define what a crisis is. And maybe it's a little bit harder to define what a day-to-day going about things and how leadership acts with teams and interacts with teams, how that contributes to those kind of things. So very interesting conversation, big scary subject. And yes, we talked about COVID, and it neatly translates to some elements. And I think there's a lot of interesting insights and parallels to how you build your teams, how you run things as a leader, how to act and react. And yet again, that there might be a couple of new ways to go about things in order to be better prepared for the future, for crisis, for surprises, for pivots, and so on. So really great talk. And before Troy reminds me of this, I stop rumbling on and let's go to the interview. Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencaster. We use Zencaster for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencaster is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code wickedpodcast. I repeat, Wicked Podcast for 40% off. And now the interview. Hemus. Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, Marcus. It's great to be here.
And so a small disclaimer, you won't hear Troy's voice today because he's over in Sweden building the future. So he's got a good excuse, at least for once. So beyond that, I will try to do my best alone here and be smart enough for our smart guests here. But before we dive into the more detail of everything, please, Jonathan, tell our audience who you are and why you wrote the book.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, so I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm the managing director of a specialist crisis management consultancy called Insignia. We work with leaders of businesses around the world, people like Cathay Pacific and Lidl and DP World, to help make sure that their leaders can do and say the right things on the most challenging days of their business careers. And the reason that I'm both in that line of work and also why I wrote the book, Crisis Proof, is because I really hate to see organizations damage not just themselves, but also their stakeholders when they mishandle a crisis. It's bad enough harming their own reputation and the value of the organization. It's just as bad, if not worse, to harm their customers, their employees, the communities in which they operate. So, my passion is to try and help organizations not do that. And the book is one of the ways in which I seek to do that. And I think what I'd recognized was there were lots of academic crisis management books, and there were lots of crisis management books written for people like me, people who work in crisis management, but there weren't any books for people within businesses who'd been given responsibility for crisis management without necessarily having the training to actually fulfill that role. And that's the gap that this book is designed to fill.
Yeah, it's lovely, and I think you can tell, and you state that at the very beginning. And I assume also that you've probably been a little bit more busy than other practices over the last year. And so I want to first ask, without maybe stating the most obvious example, sort of what makes a crisis? Where does it start to be one, and where is it still maybe not quite one? Where sort of can you describe that threshold or the definition of what that means, please?
Yeah, and I think the answer may be slightly different for every single organization. And one of the things we always encourage our clients to put into their crisis management plans is their own definition of a crisis. What does a crisis look like for you? But it certainly is an extraordinary event, a literally extraordinary event, and one which threatens either the reputation, the value, or the operations of your organization, or it threatens significant harm on your stakeholders. And there has to be a threshold. I mean, businesses are dealing with challenges and issues and sometimes incidents on a regular basis. A crisis is bigger than that. It has the potential for long term and serious harm. But as I say, I think a good discipline for any organization is to draft its own definition and maybe some examples of what a crisis event might be for them, so that they can easily recognise them when they occur.
Okay, and so given, and as you just stated, every company should just define it for themselves, just like every company, in theory, in a perfect world, should define quite a lot of things
Yeah.
for themselves and what they're unique at, not just for market positioning, but for values and what they mean and how they want to go about the people they work for and everything. But if you take that, I've worked through a lot of different industries, even in change and transformation, and as much as this complexity and the uniqueness is always there,
Mhm.
there's some similarities. Sort of, I have a bit of a checklist
Yeah.
or hygiene factors at work. What are sort of the hygiene factors or some of the commonalities you see in what a crisis is and these kind of definitions and what it means potentially when it happens to an organization?
So I think one commonality that I would emphasise first of all is the requirement to prepare for a crisis. You mentioned, Marcus, about the checklists that you have. Never are checklists more important than in a crisis, because some of the commonalities that come with a crisis are that you face uncertainty. By definition, a crisis is an uncertain time. Uncertain in the sense that you don't have all of the information. You don't understand exactly what's going on, and you certainly don't understand what's going to happen next. Another commonality is that crises almost always bring with them high stakes. They could be the very highest stakes. It could be people's health, even people's lives. As a minimum, as I say, there will be a significant potential financial or reputational impact. And of course, the other stakes are personal stakes. we've seen many examples of leaders who have ceased to be leaders of organizations after a crisis. So lack of information and high stakes are certainly commonalities. And what that brings with it is pressure. And it is only by doing your thinking, planning, training, exercising beforehand that you can be confident that you have both the tools that you require and also the capabilities and the mindset that you require.
Yeah, I think capabilities and mindset and information, there's some crucial
Yeah.
factors here. So, and I found there's quite a couple of parallels because I look at crisis, and one of the reasons in particular why this book really rang a bell was, okay, so this is when things get really, really bad,
Yeah.
maybe to the point where people actually understand, yeah, that is bad. Somewhere, if you trickle this down below what a crisis is, and let's say there's a bigger failure, which wouldn't be a crisis, and then further down you get into areas where things are just not quite right and a bit set up for potential failure, then people struggle, maybe just pull it off, but maybe not. And I work a lot on that with teams, right? So on a team level itself, and you often have leadership influencing a lot of what a team can do, what information they have, and how they can avert
Yeah.
failure. How does that sort of then translate when we look at that? So on a team level, often is what you have there is a pivot, right? Which is sort of the
Yeah.
ability or the business allowing you to change course. And I think a crisis often is, you ran in a certain direction, therefore something potentially, that's the reason why it happened. Changing course can be quite vital. How does something like that happen on a leadership level? And is there anything you can say how it potentially translates further down? Because there's one great thing to say for a leader, like, look, we all have to bring this together now, and we all have to solve this now because this just happened, and we don't want to have that happen again and get out of it, which might not often be enough information or giving someone the space to react.
Yes.
What do you see in that kind of dynamic as a first step in leadership, and a second maybe then in on team level to say, be able to say pivot? And there's probably at least two questions in there, so sorry to be a bit more complex, but
No,
how do you see that dynamic?
let me talk about leadership and how the team operates in a crisis, first of all, and then remind me about the kind of pivoting bit of it, Marcus. So, again, I would emphasize the critical importance of rehearsing for a crisis, because we've talked about a crisis being an extraordinary event that brings great pressure and high stakes. That means that teams which have not rehearsed how to operate and learned effective ways of working together under that level of pressure are very likely to fail if they try to do that the first time when the crisis is on. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, a couple of which you've already touched on. But the first reason for that is because of the pressure and the high stakes. Adrenaline flows, the amygdala gland goes into overdrive, emotions come to the fore, instinct takes over, and those are not ingredients for a considered and successful response to a crisis. I'd also touch on what you talked about in terms of leadership and team dynamics. In a crisis, it calls for a very special style of leadership and a very special kind of leader, because it's a very fine balance between consensus and command and control. And you require both of those things. So you have to work out a way of operating in a really purposeful manner, but in which you also get the best out of your team. It requires different personality types. So you require analyticals who can make sense of information. It requires creative people who can maybe think about the future. Where might this crisis go to? And how can we come up with some smart ideas about how we can address it? And it requires, yes, that traditional leader who is prepared ultimately to make decisions. So there are lots of elements at play there. And working out beforehand How are we going to operate purposefully, creating a purposeful way of working, identifying the capabilities and the personalities and the strengths and weaknesses that we have around that table? That's critical to end up with a successful result in a crisis.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting because I think, there's so many similarities with day-to-day
Yeah,
teams. A lot of my work is around, changing processes and changing mindsets often to just be open and flexible. And I think
yeah,
the ability to pivot, and I was just done a workshop a couple of months ago,
yeah,
by itself is often completely overlooked in terms
yes,
of, hang on a second, do you have a handbrake? Do you have a means or the mandate to even propose that? And often teams are
yeah,
quite pushed into, you know what, I don't care. That's the deliverable. Just aim at that, make it happen in any way possible. If you somewhere on the way, especially if you introduce things like design thinking and human-centered research to it, and you
mhm,
realize, hang on a second, it's totally the wrong problem. It's totally
yeah,
the wrong solution. Therefore, we're going to waste some money. And it happened in quite a couple of projects where even on 3 of the initial pilots, 2 of them had to pivot. The other one didn't
yeah,
pivot only because it was a greenfield sort of from scratch thing that they didn't even have before. So there was nothing that could go wrong with it because it
yeah,
didn't exist,
yeah.
which was fine.
And
But
if I
that,
can,
that yeah, sorry, just
mm,
how do you, if you're already in a crisis and that's not set up, is there any kind of hack to quickly get to it? Because that's the thing that probably happened a lot in COVID, where a
yeah,
lot of classic organizations absolutely not set up for this. Some actually still managed to rally around it. What do you
yeah.
think was the difference when the organization is still not ready, but you can actually somehow hack it or accelerate it? What's usually sort of your experience in how to
So
fast
I
track that,
guess
maybe?
two answers to that, Marcus. The first one would be if you happen to have a truly great leader within your organization who has the wisdom, the judgment, and the empathy to simply naturally do the right things. Sometimes, that is the solution. And I've seen that happen. I've seen a leader who's actually never had crisis training, just it's within them. They understand what is required at this moment in time. That is not always the case. So the second hack is, and this is not an advertisement, but quickly going out to people who do understand what
Mm,
works and quickly taking that advice to avoid making the mistakes they would otherwise make. And interestingly, one of the things you talked about, driving to an end goal, that is actually one of the things that most crisis management teams, if they don't have guidance, fail to do. Now, what do I mean by driving to a goal? Well, the best way of addressing a crisis, or the best starting point for addressing a crisis, is to understand and agree what success looks like in responding to this crisis. So when we get to the end of it, what do we want to have achieved? What does success look like? And until you do that, you have a team of people who've got their own individual perceptions of what success looks like. And the other really powerful thing that agreeing that strategic intent does is it makes decision making just a little bit more easy. Because if this is where we want to get to, and we've got a choice of at a certain point of time of taking option A or option B, we can actually have a think around the table and say, is option A or option B most likely to take us to where we want to get to? So there are a number of critical steps and thought processes and tools that teams can apply that will make them more likely to respond to the crisis successfully.
yeah. So I think there's a lot here that probably goes into the area of, listening rather than dictating, understanding,
Yeah,
which then gets me to one of my favorite topics, which is, so how much how do you then crack? I'm just gonna keep challenging you there a little
sure.
bit. Gonna make the situation worse and worse. So how do you tackle something like the Dunning Kruger effect, where people have not enough information, but on the opposite side are highly confident that they actually have more ability to do something about it than they actually have. And it's not just that, but we know as well from some other books and theories around black swans and things, where by definition the things that kick us hardest are the things we just can't see because we don't have the data, we don't have the model, we don't have the scenario, so we underestimate it so much that we literally have no means to even understand it quickly enough because there's not enough information. How do you sort of, let's start with, how do you crack those characters in leadership, for example, to say, hang on a second, sit back and listen, or for people who probably don't want to listen?
So I would come back to the critical importance of finding that out and learning from it through rehearsal. So by running a realistic scenario-based crisis simulation, you identify some of the flaws in cognitive biases, for example, that end up with you making not the best decisions. And you identify the flaws of that approach in a safe, simulated environment. And actually, a lot of enlightened leaders recognize that when they see it and when they experience it. But as I mentioned before, you want them to find that flaw before the real crisis, not during the real crisis. So the best solution to that is to find it out and learn about it before the crisis, not during the crisis. And I think it's about, having kind of got to that point, it's about recognizing the potential flaws and taking a very purposefully critical thinking approach to any assumptions, what you think you know about the situation. It's about being very aware that when you jump to a decision, just challenging yourself or getting another team member to challenge you as to why you believe that is the right decision to make. It's about overcoming the heuristics, those kind of thinking shortcuts that we all jump to. So you need a team which has reached the point at which there is psychological safety, where there is maturity, and where there is respect for each other, so that in a crisis we don't make those mistakes of how we think, and we actually apply rigor to the decisions we're making. And of course, there is another dilemma here, because one of the other big traps to avoid in a crisis is waiting too long to make a decision. Because if you spend too long analysing or arguing back and forth which way to go, the crisis will have run ahead of you before you've had time to make your decision. So it's about, again, this purposeful, timely approach to working where, yes, appropriate challenge and analysis goes in, but you do get to a point at which you can make a decision in a timely manner.
So I'd like to bring this down now to maybe some quite detailed examples or scenarios or moments. So we talked about what the hurdles might be, but let's say I'm on board with the idea that, look, we need this, we need to train this up, we need to have a
Yeah.
plan in place, we need to be ready, and need to relearn, so adjust it as we go along year by year, just to be as ready as we can possibly be. How do I sell that to the leadership or whoever I am in the business? How do I sell this? So you mentioned in the book a couple of key moments that are more likely to succeed in selling the idea of it, the investment towards it, and the general shift of mindset or improvement of mindset that get you into a better ready state. Can you elaborate a little bit on what those some of those key moments are for people who want to go there, just to pick the right time for those conversations? Because normally you hear like, oh, well, we don't have time for this now, or we know those arguments. So what are those moments?
Well, I would say right now, as we're talking in the autumn of 2021, now is a very good time for having those conversations, because any leader who now says that a major crisis can't affect my business is never going to be convinced if they don't believe it now.
Yeah.
So literally, post-COVID, is a good time to be talking about how we might prepare better for the next crisis. But in more general terms, I think when an organisation has had a near miss, so they had an incident which didn't turn into a crisis but could have done, that is a good moment to open up that conversation. Another really good moment to open up that conversation is when a competitor suffers a crisis. Here in the UK, when we had the horse meat crisis, where it turned out that many foods contained horse meat when it was supposed to be beef, that was a real wake up call for the entire food industry, not just for those directly affected, that how could a similar crisis affect us? So I think when there's something going on in your industry or to a competitor, that's a really good time to have a conversation. When there's a new incoming leader, because it's easier to look at maybe some of the shortcomings or flaws of an organization or things that need improving when you're coming in new than maybe when you've been presiding over that organization for 15 or 20 years. So there are a number of times when, those kinds of suggestions are more likely to be accepted than others, and those are some of them.
Yeah, I remember exactly one moment like that in one of my projects as well, where essentially we were able to take the numbers of a failure from a
Yeah.
competitor to go, look, this is how big this could be for you.
Yeah.
And that convinced people very, very quickly, because it wasn't just about here's some numbers, but actually this
Yeah.
literally happened, where people lost customers and damages and legal and fees and whatnot. It was pretty significant, to the ring
I
of, I
mean,
think,
I'm
300
sure you remember the
million.
Chile mine rescue, which
Yes.
was on our TV screens for weeks. Um, we had a lot of inquiries from mining companies in the immediate aftermath of that situation. All mining companies rehearse for the operational response to a crisis, how to get men out of the mine. But what that crisis revealed was the intense media, governmental, regulatory, all the stakeholder interest that comes with a crisis in the mining industry. And, that was a catalyst for, I think, a lot of the mining industry saying, if that had been our mine, how would we have responded to it? So, yes,
So
there are
that,
many examples like that.
yeah, I think there's many examples of crisis and disasters these days, aren't there? So I wanna then get to the obvious elephant in the room that I needed to ask about, of course. So famously, I think the NHS had a drill around something like COVID to happen,
Mhm.
and they did that, and they had a lot of recommendations for the government that, as far as I understand, and I don't know all the details, probably nobody does, it wasn't really implemented, really followed up. But in general, the plan was there, insights were there. It wasn't a scenario. The same with 9/11, right? It wasn't a scenario that no one had considered. It wasn't a scenario that no one had planned a drill through.
Yeah.
All these existed. So whatever the politicians told us, these things existed. What makes these things fail? So despite the fact, before I go potentially to the last question about scenarios, which is very fascinating, what makes these things still fail? Because there seems to be enough in place or enough data just sitting somewhere where you literally just could grab it the day after because it sits there. Why is it still such a challenge?
So, as I understand it, and again, I don't have full visibility of everything that went on, but with COVID, as I understand it, the UK government had a plan, but it was based on a different kind of virus. It was based on a conventional flu rather than COVID. Equally, 9/11 is a very interesting example. You'll know there's a guy called Gus Whitcomb who was um, heading up communications for American Airlines on 9/11. And he said one of the things that sideswiped them on 9/11 was, for example, that they hadn't planned for multiple aircraft being lost at the same time. They had also planned in their crisis management playbook to immediately travel to the scene of the incident. And so the first two things that happened were different to what was in their playbook. And likewise, as I say, I understand that that was, one of the challenges with the government plan. And I think what that flags up is your crisis management plan should be, your core crisis management plan should be kind of crisis agnostic. It should be a purposeful way of operating, getting an understanding of the situation and making decisions, whatever the crisis is. And then you may have some supplementary playbooks that are risk specific. And if it is one of those risks that turn up, so much the better. But having the core way of working is the starting point for managing any crisis type. And I suspect, as I say, that was one of the reasons why, as you say, the plan that was carefully drafted didn't work. Of course, we also don't know. Ultimately, it's leaders who will decide how the plan is deployed and what decisions are made. And one might say that some of the decisions and some of the leadership could have been better.
Yeah. So, as usual, we have more questions than time. So that means that here comes the last question. And I know Troy keeps reminding me not to mumble about too lengthy, but a lot of it reminded me of the famous scene in Fight Club when they're in the airplane and talk about um, a car company potentially pulling back the cars because they know they're flawed and then running the numbers, and then basically because it's cheaper to get sued, they don't take the cars back. I think we had some recent similar things happening in organizations with Amazon and the workers in the distribution centers who um, really started to rebel about the working conditions. And Facebook, famously, it coming out that the emotional psychological impact on customers was taken on board and saying that's okay in favor for profits. So when we talk about these human risks, I would still say probably Facebook had no real idea about the complexity of the impact that they're having.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, sort of what's your dream team, and how much budget, maybe percentage by year on year revenue or something, would you give towards safeguarding yourself against crisis? Because crises have a massive impact on, as you say in the book, stock price and whatever. So some companies lose like 50% of their value through
Yeah.
these. What do you have? Do you have sort of a recipe for that, or sort of a number for that, or sort of what it takes to invest in being prepped for this?
Well, the ironic thing is that the number would be absolutely tiny as a percentage of turnover for almost any organization of any size. I don't think we're even talking about, certainly for someone as big as Facebook, we're not even talking about 0.1% of turnover. And, some organizations simply don't want to spend money on what they perceive as something that will never happen and that they're not going to get a return on if it doesn't happen. The interesting thing, though, is that organizations who do invest less than 0.1% of their turnover in planning for a crisis, they not only make sure that they are ready to respond if the worst does happen, by going through that process, they reduce the chance of it happening in the first place, and they actually learn business as usual skills. We've talked about decision making, situational awareness, critical thinking. These are all skills, disciplines, tools, and techniques that can be used in business as usual. And we do have a number of clients who, for example, have adopted our methodology for making swift progress through a meeting for all of their normal meetings because they've suffered from, meetings that ramble on or don't reach outcomes or objectives. So it's a very small amount. It requires the commitment of someone at the top to say it is worth making this investment, but it will not only make sure they are ready to respond, as I say, it will reduce the chance of it happening in the first place, and it will have real benefits for business as usual.
So, as a last notion, and I'm probably looking for an answer of one or two sentences just because of what you said and just what popped up in my head. When I used to work for industries like the museums, there's a lot of health and safety going on, right? So you're actually mitigating risks all the time. And there's a price to pay for this, obviously, because you can get people injured, people can die, and you talk about, the aerospace industry, whatever, that there's lives at stake. And I know from, I think, pharma companies and others, there are legal implications for that in terms of negligence. Isn't there is it time for a general, wider idea of negligence towards that if you're not spending time and money on those kind of preparedness?
Yeah, I think there's a real argument for that. I also think that trust is one of the critical assets that an organization has, the trust of its key stakeholders. And whilst you can continue to succeed for a short time with diminishing trust, I think if you adopt an approach which diminishes trust over time, that is going to be very, very bad news in terms of your self-interest over the longer term.
Yeah. Wonderful. Unfortunately, our time is up. I could probably talk to you for hours about this. It's a very fascinating subject matter and a really, really interesting, great, insightful book. So, but for now, I'll say thank you so much for your insights and answers, and thank you for being with us.
Marcus, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it very much.
You've been listening to the Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.